When the billionaire grabbed Olivia Carter's hand, she whispered 7 words that shattered her entire world. But before that moment changed everything, Olivia was just another invisible face in the sterile corridors of Chicago General Hospital. At 27, Olivia moved through her 12-hour shifts like a ghost in scrubs. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the polished linoleum as she navigated between rooms, carrying medications, adjusting IV drips, and offering comfort to patients who rarely looked up from their phones long enough to acknowledge her presence. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under her eyes, eyes that had seen too much suffering and received too little recognition in return. Room 314 needs another blanket, she murmured to herself, checking the silver watch that had belonged to her mother, the only tangible connection she had to a past that remained frustratingly blank. The watch face caught the overhead lights as she moved, its worn leather band wrapped around her delicate wrist like a tether to questions that would never find answers. Olivia had learned early that being unremarkable was a survival strategy. In the foster system, drawing attention meant trouble. In nursing school, blending in meant avoiding the cruel whispers about scholarship kids who didn't belong. Here at Chicago General, invisibility meant she could do her job without the petty politics and power games that consumed her colleagues. But invisibility also meant that when Mrs. Patterson in 312 finally smiled after 3 weeks of recovery, no one noticed that Olivia had spent her lunch breaks reading to the elderly woman. When the teenage car accident victim in 318 stopped having nightmares, nobody realized it was because Olivia had sat by his bedside during her breaks, sharing stories about resilience and hope. She existed in the spaces between recognition and rejection, caring for people who would forget her name by the time they signed their discharge papers. Carter, the sharp voice of head nurse Bradley, cut through the ambient hum of the hospital. Olivia's shoulders tensed reflexively. That tone always preceded criticism or extra work. "You're being reassigned to the VIP wing tomorrow." Mrs. Lancaster specifically requested a discreet nurse. The way Bradley pronounced discreet made it sound like a character flaw rather than a professional asset. Olivia nodded silently, already knowing that VIP assignments typically meant dealing with demanding patients who viewed hospital staff as personal servants rather than healthcare professionals. That evening, Olivia sat in her studio apartment overlooking the city's skyline, researching her new patient on her laptop. Vivian Lancaster's name dominated financial news websites. The Iron Lady of Chicago's elite, petroleum heiress worth $3.2 billion, the woman who never shows weakness. Photo after photo showed an elderly woman with perfectly styled silver hair, designer clothing, and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the camera. At 83, Vivian Lancaster had been widowed for 15 years, inheriting an oil empire that she'd managed with ruthless efficiency. The articles painted her as cold, calculating and completely isolated by her own choice. No children mentioned, no close family, no friends, just business associates and paid staff who maintained professional distance. Olivia traced the silver watch on her wrist, a habit she'd developed whenever contemplating life's mysteries. What would it be like to have so much power, yet appear so utterly alone? The photographs showed lavish penthouses and charity galas, but Vivian's eyes held an emptiness that no amount of wealth seemed to fill. As she prepared for bed, Olivia caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her dark hair fell in gentle waves around a face that patients often described as kind but never memorable. Her brown eyes, her most distinctive feature, seemed to hold depths that she herself couldn't fully understand. Foster families had sometimes commented on those eyes, saying they seemed older than her years, as if they'd witnessed things beyond her conscious memory. She touched the watch again, wondering if her mother had looked at her with those same eyes. Had her mother been a nurse too? A teacher? Someone who cared for others? The questions cycled through her mind like a prayer without an answer, leaving her with the familiar ache of belonging nowhere and to no one. Tomorrow, she would enter Vivian Lancaster's world, a world of privilege and power that existed in stark contrast to her own reality. She had no way of knowing that this assignment would unlock doors that had been sealed since childhood, or that 7 whispered words would reveal a truth that would transform her understanding of everything she thought she knew about herself. The City lights twinkled beyond her window as Olivia finally drifted to sleep. Her mother's watch ticking softly on the nightstand, a metronome counting down to a revelation that would change her life forever. The VIP wing of Chicago General felt like entering a different world entirely. Gone were the bustling hallways and constant chatter of the general wards. Here, thick carpeting muffled footsteps, original artwork adorned the walls, and even the air seemed to carry the subtle scent of expensive flowers rather than antiseptic. Olivia adjusted her badge as she approached room 4201, the penthouse suite that Vivian Lancaster had occupied for the past week, following what the charts diplomatically termed exhaustion and dehydration. The real story, whispered among the nursing staff, involved a public collapse at a board meeting, a crack in the Iron Lady's seemingly impenetrable armor. Remember, head nurse Bradley had warned during the morning briefing, Mrs. Lancaster values privacy above all else. No small talk, no personal questions, and certainly no attempts at friendship. She's here to recover, not to socialize with the help. The way Bradley emphasized the help made Olivia's cheeks burn, but she'd long ago learned that responding to such comments only made things worse. Instead, she knocked softly on the door and entered. When she heard a crisp "come in," Vivian Lancaster sat propped against silk pillows, her silver hair perfectly styled despite her hospital stay. She wore a designer nightgown that probably cost more than Olivia's monthly rent, and her pale blue eyes surveyed the young nurse with the analytical precision of someone accustomed to evaluating assets and liabilities. "You must be my new keeper," Vivian said, her voice carrying the cultivated accent of old money and elite education. "I trust you understand the importance of discretion." "Of course, Mrs. Lancaster. I'm Olivia Carter, and I'll be your primary nurse during the day shift." Olivia kept her voice professional, but something in the older woman's gaze made her feel exposed, as if those piercing eyes could see straight through her carefully maintained composure. Vivian's expression flickered, just for a moment, when Olivia introduced herself, but the mask of cool detachment quickly returned. "I have specific requirements. No unnecessary conversation, no hovering, and absolutely no discussion of my condition with anyone outside this room. Are we clear?" "Perfectly clear, ma'am." For the next several hours, they maintained a careful dance of professional interaction. Olivia checked vitals, administered medications, and ensured Vivian's comfort, without crossing the invisible boundary that the older woman had established. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being studied, observed with an intensity that went beyond normal patient wariness. During lunch break, Olivia found herself in the hospital's small chapel, not because she was particularly religious, but because it was one of the few quiet spaces where she could think. Her friend Marcus, a fellow nurse from the pediatric ward, slid into the pew beside her. "Heard you got the Ice Queen assignment," he said with a gentle smile. Marcus had been her closest friend since nursing school, one of the few people who saw past her reserved exterior to the warmth she kept carefully hidden. "How's it going?" "Strange," Olivia admitted, absently touching her mother's watch. "She keeps looking at me like she's trying to solve a puzzle." "It's probably nothing, but your instincts are usually right about people," Marcus finished. He'd learned to trust Olivia's intuitive understanding of patients, even when she couldn't articulate why she felt certain ways about them. "What does your gut tell you?" Olivia considered the question. "That she's not as cold as everyone thinks. There's something wounded about her, and lonely, desperately lonely." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "The ultra-wealthy often are. All that money and power, but no one who actually cares about them as people rather than assets." When Olivia returned to room 4201, she found Vivian staring out the window at the city skyline. The afternoon sun cast golden light across her face, softening the harsh lines that constant vigilance had carved around her eyes and mouth. "The view from up here is quite different from the lower floors, isn't it?" Vivian asked without turning around. Olivia approached cautiously, uncertain whether this qualified as forbidden small talk. "Here it is. You can see the whole city from this angle. Distance has its advantages. People look manageable from this height. Their problems seem smaller." Vivian's voice carried an odd wistfulness. "But sometimes distance becomes a prison of its own making." There was something in that admission that made Olivia's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. She'd spent her entire life feeling distant from others, but by necessity rather than choice. What would it be like to have deliberately built walls so high that you couldn't find your way back down? "Your medication is due in an hour," Olivia said gently. "Is there anything you need in the meantime?" Vivian turned then, and for just a moment, her mask slipped entirely. Her eyes held a vulnerability that was both shocking and heartbreaking, like glimpsing a frightened child hiding inside an impenetrable fortress. "No," Vivian whispered, her voice softer than it had been all day. "I have everything I need." But as she said it, her gaze lingered on Olivia's face with an intensity that made the young nurse's breath catch. There was recognition in those pale blue eyes, not of Olivia herself, but of something deeper. Something that seemed to stir memories long buried beneath layers of protective ice. Olivia felt the familiar weight of her mother's watch against her wrist, its steady ticking suddenly loud in the silence that stretched between them. Whatever was happening in this room went far beyond normal patient care, and she had the unsettling feeling that she was standing on the edge of something that would change everything she thought she knew about her carefully ordered world. It happened during what should have been a routine evening medication check Olivia had just finished, updating Vivian's chart, when she noticed the older woman's hands trembling as she reached for her water glass. Without thinking, she stepped forward to help, a gesture that had become second nature after years of caring for patients who struggled with simple tasks. "Let me," Olivia said softly, her fingers brushing against Vivian's as she steadied the glass. The contact was electric. Vivian's entire body went rigid, her pale blue eyes widening as they locked onto Olivia's face. The water glass slipped from her nerveless fingers, sending water cascading across the silk bedding. But neither woman moved to clean up the mess. For a heartbeat, the world seemed suspended in absolute silence. Then Vivian's carefully constructed armor shattered completely. Her breath came in sharp, irregular gasps. Her hands that had signed billion-dollar deals and commanded corporate empires, began to shake uncontrollably. Tears gathered in her eyes, spilling down cheeks that hadn't shown emotion in decades. "No," she whispered, the word broken and desperate. "Here it can't be." Olivia instinctively reached out, her training kicking in as she recognized the signs of an anxiety attack. But when her palm touched Vivian's arm, offering comfort the way she had to countless patients, the older woman grabbed her hand with surprising strength. Vivian's fingers traced the contours of Olivia's face with trembling reverence, as if she were touching something sacred that she'd believed lost forever. Her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that had intimidated business rivals for decades, now overflowed with tears that seemed to come from some bottomless well of grief. "You have her eyes," Vivian breathed, her voice barely audible. "You have my daughter's eyes." The words hit Olivia like a physical blow. She tried to step back, but Vivian's grip on her hand tightened. Desperate and pleading, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Lancaster, but I think you might be confused." 26 years, Vivian continued, her voice gaining strength even as tears continued to fall. 26 years I've looked for those eyes. The same dark brown with those little gold flecks around the iris. The same shape, the same depth. Oh God, how is this possible? Olivia's mind reeled. 26 years ago, she would have been barely a year old. The timing aligned perfectly with her earliest memories, or rather the absence of them. She'd always known she was found abandoned at a Chicago hospital as a toddler, with no identification except for her mother's silver watch, the watch. As if reading her thoughts, Vivian's gaze dropped to Olivia's wrist. When she saw the worn leather band and familiar silver face, her sob tore through the room like a physical wound. "Where did you get that?" Vivian demanded, her voice oscillating between wonder and anguish. It was with me when I was found. The social worker said it was the only clue to my identity." Olivia's voice sounded strange to her own ears, as if someone else was speaking the words. Vivian's free hand moved to her throat, where a delicate chain disappeared beneath her nightgown. With trembling fingers, she pulled out a locket, silver, with an intricate engraving that matched the pattern on Olivia's watch perfectly. "I gave this set to my daughter for her first birthday," Vivian whispered. The watch was sized to fit her when she got older. The locket has her picture inside. With hands that shook like autumn leaves, Vivian opened the locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of a baby, with enormous dark eyes and wisps of brown hair. But it was the eyes that stopped Olivia's heart. Eyes that looked exactly like her own reflection, The room spun around her. All the questions that had haunted her childhood, all the empty spaces where memories should have been, suddenly took on new significance. The foster families who'd commented on her unusual composure, the way she'd always felt like she was searching for something she couldn't name. "This isn't possible," Olivia said, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Olivia Carter. I was abandoned at Memorial Hospital when I was barely 2 years old. There's no record of my parents, no—" "Memorial Hospital," Vivian repeated, her voice breaking. "That's where I left you, where I had to leave you." The admission hung in the air like a confession, heavy with decades of pain and regret. "You left me." The words came out harder than Olivia intended, years of abandonment issues suddenly crystallizing into sharp-edged anger. "You chose to abandon your child." Vivian's face crumpled. "I was 23 and married to a monster. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought having a child might change him, might make him capable of love. But he became worse, violent, dangerous. And when you were born—" She took a shuddering breath, her grip on Olivia's hand never loosening. "He said terrible things about you, about what he would do to you. I realized that the only way to keep you safe was to get you as far away from him as possible. I thought if I gave you up, you'd have a chance at a normal life, a safe life." Olivia felt her world tilting on its axis. Everything she'd believed about herself, about her origins, about why she'd been abandoned, all of it was shifting like sand beneath her feet. "So you left me at a hospital and walked away?" The hurt in her voice was raw, unfiltered. "I watched from across the street for 3 hours, Vivian said, her voice barely audible, "until I saw the nurses find you and take you inside safely. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I've regretted it every single day since." The beeping of medical equipment seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Olivia stared at this woman, this billionaire who'd built an empire while searching for the daughter she'd given up, and felt 26 years of questions demanding answers all at once. But before she could process any of it, before she could even begin to understand what this revelation meant, the door burst open and head nurse Bradley rushed in. "What's going on here?" We could hear crying from the hallway. Bradley stopped short when she saw Vivian's tear-stained face and Olivia's shocked expression. "Carter, what did you do?" The accusation in Bradley's voice cut through Olivia like a blade. After years of careful professionalism, she was being blamed for what appeared to be a patient's emotional breakdown, and she couldn't even begin to explain what had actually happened. "Mrs. Lancaster seems upset," Olivia managed, her voice carefully neutral despite the chaos raging in her chest. She was providing excellent care," Vivian interjected, her voice regaining some of its commanding authority as she quickly wiped away her tears. The transformation was remarkable. Within seconds, the vulnerable woman who had just claimed to be Olivia's mother was replaced by the steely matriarch that Chicago's elite both feared and respected. "I became emotional due to personal memories." Nurse Carter handled the situation with perfect professionalism. Bradley's suspicious gaze moved between them, clearly sensing undercurrents she couldn't identify. "Perhaps it would be best if we assigned a different nurse to your case, Mrs. Lancaster, someone with more experience in sensitive situations." "No." The word came out sharp enough to cut glass. "Nurse Carter stays." "That's non-negotiable." The head nurse's face flushed at the dismissal, but she couldn't argue with a patient whose hospital donations likely exceeded her annual salary. "Very well. Carter, I'll need to see you for debriefing after your shift." When the door closed behind Bradley, leaving them alone again, the weight of what had just transpired settled over the room like heavy fog. Vivian had just claimed to be her mother, the mother who had abandoned her 26 years ago, the mother she'd spent her entire life wondering about, creating fantasy versions of in her childhood imagination. "I need to see your birth records," Olivia said abruptly. "Hospital files, adoption paperwork, anything that proves what you're saying." Vivian nodded as if she'd expected this request. "My lawyer has been maintaining files on your case for decades. Every lead we followed, every private investigator we hired, every dead end we encountered. I never stopped looking for you. If you never stopped looking, why didn't you find me sooner? I've been working at hospitals in Chicago for years." The question seemed to age Vivian before Olivia's eyes. "You were adopted under a different name. The records were sealed. Your identity legally changed. We knew you'd been placed with a family, but every trail went cold after that. When I heard the name Olivia Carter on your badge today, it meant nothing to me. But your eyes..." She reached toward Olivia's face again, then stopped herself, as if remembering that this revelation hadn't erased 26 years of separation. "What was my original name?" Olivia asked quietly. "Elena. Elena Rose Lancaster." Vivian's voice broke slightly on the name. "You were named after your great-grandmother, a woman who defied her family to marry for love rather than money. I thought if you inherited even half of her strength, you'd survive whatever life threw at you." Elena Rose Lancaster. Olivia tested the name in her mind, trying to see if it felt more real than the identity she'd carried her entire life. It felt foreign, like a coat that didn't quite fit. But there was something underneath the strangeness, a sense of completion she'd never experienced before. "The man you were married to," Olivia continued, her nursing instincts helping her maintain clinical detachment, while her emotions roiled beneath the surface. "My father, is he still alive?" Vivian's face hardened. "Richard Lancaster died in a car accident 8 years ago. Drunk driving. The irony is that his death was probably the first considerate thing he ever did." There was a bitterness in her voice that spoke to years of abuse and terror, painting a picture of why a young mother might feel desperate enough to abandon her child, rather than risk exposing her to a violent father. "I need time to process this," Olivia said finally, "and I need proof. Real documentation, not just similar eyes and a matching watch. Of course. I'll have my lawyer here tomorrow morning with everything. Birth records, DNA test results if you want them, photos from when you were a baby. Whatever you need to believe that I'm telling you the truth." Vivian paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of decades of regret. "I don't expect forgiveness, Elena. Olivia. I don't expect anything from you, except the chance to finally tell you the truth about why I made the choices I did. You've clearly built a beautiful life, despite what I put you through. I can see the kind of person you've become, compassionate, professional, strong, everything I hoped you'd grow up to be." The compliment should have felt good, but instead it highlighted the vast gulf between them. Vivian had watched from a distance as Olivia struggled through foster care, worked her way through nursing school with scholarships and part-time jobs, and built a career helping others. She'd done it all alone, without the advantage of family wealth or connections. "I need to finish my shift," Olivia said, standing on unsteady legs. We can talk more tomorrow, after I've seen the documentation." As she reached for the door handle, Vivian's voice stopped her. "I know this changes everything for you, and I'm sorry for that. But Olivia, I need you to be careful who you tell about this. My enemies would use any perceived weakness against me, and now that I've found you..." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Olivia's existence represented a vulnerability in Vivian's armor, something that could be exploited by business rivals or social climbers looking for leverage against the Iron Lady of Chicago's elite. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" Olivia asked. "I'm saying that being a Lancaster comes with complications you've been fortunate to avoid until now. Money and power create as many enemies as allies, and some people would do anything to get their hands on a piece of the Lancaster fortune." The reality of wealth and its consequences was something Olivia had never had to consider. She'd built her life on hard work and genuine relationships, not on the treacherous politics of high society. As she left room 4201, her mind reeling with questions and possibilities, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The revelation of her identity had opened a door that could never be closed again, and she had no idea what waited on the other side. Her mother's watch, her watch, ticked steadily against her wrist, keeping time with a heart that was no longer sure of anything it had once believed to be true. Olivia couldn't sleep. She spent the night pacing her small apartment, replaying every detail of the encounter with Vivian Lancaster, the woman who claimed to be her mother. The silver watch felt heavier on her wrist, no longer just a memento of unknown origins, but potentially a tangible link to a past that was more complex and dangerous than she'd ever imagined. By 3 a.m., she found herself at her laptop, searching for everything she could find about the Lancaster family. What she discovered painted a picture of wealth, power, and tragedy that made her stomach clench with unease. Richard Lancaster had been a petroleum magnate whose business practices were as ruthless as his personal relationships. The society pages from the 1990s showed him with Vivian at various charity events. Her smiles bright but brittle, her posture perfect but tense. In every photograph, she looked like a woman playing a role rather than living her life. The articles about Richard's death were brief and clinical, noting the accident and his blood alcohol level, but offering no speculation about his character or relationships. Typical of how the wealthy manage their scandals, quietly, efficiently, with minimal public exposure. But it was the gap in coverage that intrigued Olivia most. For nearly 2 years in the late 1990s, Vivian Lancaster had virtually disappeared from Chicago's social scene. The timing aligned perfectly with Olivia's birth and abandonment. When her alarm finally buzzed at 7 a.m., Olivia felt hollow with exhaustion, but electric with nervous energy. She arrived at the hospital early, hoping to speak with Vivian before the lawyer, arrived with documentation that would either confirm or destroy the bombshell revelation from the previous day. She found Vivian already awake and dressed in an elegant silk blouse and designer slacks, no longer the vulnerable patient in a hospital gown, but the commanding presence that had built a business empire. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," Vivian said quietly. "I almost didn't." Olivia checked the medical chart, noting that Vivian's vital signs had been elevated throughout the night, evidence that she'd been as sleepless and anxious as Olivia. "But I need answers. They'll be here soon. My lawyer, the documentation, everything you asked for." Vivian's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. "But first, I need to tell you about the danger." "What danger?" Vivian gestured toward the chair beside her bed, and after a moment's hesitation, Olivia sat down. When Richard died, his will was complicated. He'd made provisions that would only take effect if certain conditions were met, including the discovery of any biological children he might have had. His family, his brothers and their children, have been fighting over control of the Lancaster holdings for years. Olivia felt a chill run down her spine. "You're saying they don't know about me?" "They know Richard had a child with me, but they believe that child died shortly after birth. That's the story I allowed them to believe because it kept you safe." Vivian's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "If they discover you're alive, they'll do everything in their power to either claim you as an ally or eliminate you as a threat." Eliminate? The word came out strangled. "The Lancaster fortune is worth billions, Elena, Olivia. People have killed for much less." Before Olivia could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. A distinguished man in an expensive suit entered, carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than Olivia herself. "James Morrison," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "I've been Mrs. Lancaster's attorney for 30 years, and I've been hoping to meet you for 26 of them." He set the briefcase on the hospital bed's rolling table and opened it with practiced efficiency. Inside were manila folders organized with legal precision, each one labeled with dates and case numbers. "Let's start with the basics," Morrison said, withdrawing a document that looked official and intimidating. "This is your original birth certificate, filed before the name change and sealed adoption records." Olivia took the paper with trembling hands. There, in formal legal language, was proof that Elena Rose Lancaster had been born on the date she'd always celebrated as her birthday. To parents listed as Vivian Elizabeth Lancaster and Richard Thomas Lancaster. "DNA comparison results," Morrison continued, handing her another folder. "We had samples from when you were born, and we've maintained them all these years. The match is conclusive. The scientific certainty was overwhelming. All the fantasies she'd created about her origins, kind parents who died tragically, a teenage mother who couldn't provide for her, even the possibility that she'd been kidnapped. None of them had prepared her for the reality of a mother who'd made an impossible choice to protect her child from an abusive father." "There's more," Morrison said, his voice gentle but serious. "Trust funds that have been accumulating interest since your birth. Property holdings that were designated for you. And most importantly, a legal claim to a portion of the Lancaster estate that could make you one of the wealthiest women in Chicago." Olivia's head spun. "I don't want money. I just wanted to know where I came from." "Unfortunately, wanting and having are different things when it comes to inheritances this size," Morrison explained. "The moment your identity becomes public knowledge, You'll be thrust into a world of legal battles, social obligations, and potential threats that you've never had to consider. Vivian leaned forward, her eyes intense with urgency. That's why we need to be strategic about how we handle this revelation. There are people who would hurt you to get control of what you've inherited, and others who would use you as a pawn in their own power games. The weight of it all pressed down on Olivia like a physical force. 24 hours ago, her biggest concern had been whether she'd remembered to update a patient's chart. Now she was being told that her very existence posed a threat to some people and an opportunity to others. "I need air," she said abruptly, standing so quickly that the chair scraped against the floor. "I need to think about all of this." "Of course," Vivian said. "But Olivia, please be careful who you trust with this information. Until we decide how to proceed, your safety depends on discretion." As Olivia left the room, her mind reeled with the implications of everything she'd just learned. She wasn't just Olivia Carter, the invisible nurse, anymore. She was Eleanor Rose Lancaster, heir to a fortune that came with enemies and complications she couldn't even begin to understand. The silver watch on her wrist ticked steadily, but now its rhythm sounded less like comfort and more like a countdown to consequences she couldn't predict or control. She'd wanted answers about her past, but she was beginning to realize that some truths came with a price that could change everything she'd built for herself, and not necessarily for the better. 3 days after the revelation, Olivia found herself in a world she'd only glimpsed from the outside, the penthouse office of Lancaster Industries, 60 floors above the Chicago streets, where she'd grown up invisible and forgotten. James Morrison had insisted on the meeting, explaining that there were security protocols to establish and legal documents to review. But as Olivia stood before floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, she felt like an imposter, wearing borrowed clothes. The designer blazer Vivian had sent, something appropriate for the offices, felt like a costume that didn't quite fit her true self. "The Lancaster family tree is complicated," Morrison explained, spreading genealogical charts across the mahogany conference table. Richard had 2 brothers, both deceased, but their children and grandchildren have been circling the estate like vultures since his death. Olivia studied the family tree, trying to make sense of the web of relationships that she was now part of, whether she wanted to be or not. Names like Harrison Lancaster Thread and Victoria Lancaster Ashworth represented people who had grown up with privilege she couldn't imagine, but also people who might view her as a threat to their inheritance. "The most dangerous is probably Edward Lancaster," Morrison continued, pointing to a photograph of a man in his 50s, with cold eyes and a politician's smile. "Richard's nephew. He's been acting as executor of the estate and has grown quite comfortable in that role. Your existence threatens his position significantly, and he doesn't know about me yet, not officially. But Edward has resources, connections, and very little moral restraint when it comes to protecting his interests. The moment your identity becomes public, he'll either try to discredit you or—" Morrison's pause hung heavy in the air. "Or what?" Olivia pressed. "Or he'll try to eliminate the threat you represent." Before Olivia could fully process that chilling statement, the conference room door opened and Marcus walked in, looking as out of place as she felt, but trying to hide it with characteristic good humor. "I hope you don't mind," Vivian said, following behind him. "I thought you might want a familiar face here, someone you trust." Marcus's presence was like a lifeline in turbulent water. He'd been her anchor through nursing school, her confidant during difficult shifts, and the closest thing to family she'd known before discovering her biological connections. When she'd finally told him the truth about her, identity sworn to secrecy but desperate for someone to help her process the overwhelming reality, he'd responded with the steady support she'd come to depend. "Oh, this is insane," Marcus said quietly, taking in the opulent surroundings. 3 days ago you were worried about rent, and now you're sitting in a boardroom that probably costs more than both our salaries combined." "It doesn't feel real," Olivia admitted. "Any of it." Morrison cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the documents spread across the table. "The reality, I'm afraid, is that your situation has become quite urgent. We've received word that Edward Lancaster has been asking questions about hospital records from 26 years ago. He's getting close to discovering the truth." Vivian's face went pale. "How close?" "Close enough that we need to consider our options carefully. We can continue to keep Olivia's identity secret, but that becomes more difficult and dangerous with each passing day. Or? Olivia asked, though she suspected she wasn't going to like the alternative. Or we reveal the truth publicly, on our terms, in a way that makes it difficult for Edward to challenge or suppress. The thought of stepping into the spotlight, of becoming a public figure with all the scrutiny and attention that would bring, made Olivia's stomach churn. She'd spent her entire life in the shadows, finding comfort in anonymity. There's a third option, Marcus said unexpectedly. Everyone turned to look at him, and he shifted uncomfortably under their attention. What if Olivia, Elena, whatever she wants to be called, what if she just walks away, renounces any claim to the inheritance, and goes back to her life as a nurse? She can't, Vivian said immediately. Even if she wanted to, Edward won't just let her disappear now that she's been identified as a potential threat. He'll want to ensure she can never come back to claim what's legally hers. And legally it is hers, Morrison added. Richard's will specifically provides for any biological children, regardless of circumstances. The law is clear on this point. Olivia felt trapped between impossible choices: claim her inheritance and enter a dangerous world of wealth and power that she'd never wanted, or try to disappear and risk being hunted by people who saw her as a threat to their own security. What would happen if we went public? She asked finally. Morrison and Vivian exchanged a look that suggested they'd been hoping she'd ask that question. There would be a media circus initially, Morrison admitted. The story is too compelling for the press to ignore. Missing heiress returns after 26 years, worth billions, dramatic reunion. But once the initial excitement dies down, you'd have legal protection that you don't have while hiding. And I'd have to learn to navigate their world, Olivia said, gesturing toward the luxurious office around them. Charity galas, board meetings, social obligations I've never even imagined. You'd have help, Vivian said quietly. I've spent 26 years preparing for the possibility of finding you again. I know it's overwhelming, but you don't have to face any of this alone. Marcus reached across the table and squeezed Olivia's hand. Whatever you decide, I've got your back. But for what it's worth, I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. You've survived everything life has thrown at you so far. Olivia looked around the room, at Morrison with his legal expertise, at Vivian with her decades of wealth and power, at Marcus with his unwavering loyalty, and realized that for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't facing a crisis completely alone. If we do this, she said slowly, if we go public, how do we protect ourselves from Edward and anyone else who might want to hurt me? We make sure the revelation happens at a very public venue, with witnesses and media present, Morrison said. Someplace where any retaliation would be immediately visible and investigated. The annual Lancaster Foundation Gala, Vivian said suddenly. It's next weekend. Every major figure in Chicago society will be there, along with press coverage and security. If we're going to reveal your identity publicly, that would be the perfect stage. The irony wasn't lost on Olivia. She'd spent her entire career caring for people behind the scenes, and now she was contemplating stepping into the spotlight at one of Chicago's most exclusive social events. 1 week, she said finally. I need 1 week to prepare for whatever comes next. As they left the Lancaster Industries building, Marcus walking beside her through the marble lobby that still felt like foreign territory, Olivia caught sight of her reflection in the polished elevator doors. The woman looking back at her wore expensive clothes and carried herself with new awareness of her own worth. But her eyes, those distinctive eyes that had started this entire revelation, still held the same depth and compassion that had made her a good nurse. Maybe she could learn to navigate this new world without losing the parts of herself that mattered most. The week passed in a blur of preparation that felt like cramming for the most important exam of Olivia's life, except this test would determine not just her grade, but her survival in a world she was still learning to navigate. Vivian had arranged for what she diplomatically called cultural orientation sessions. These turned out to be intensive tutorials in everything from proper etiquette at charity galas to the subtle power dynamics of Chicago's elite social circles. A woman named Catherine, who had served as a protocol advisor to several prominent families, spent hours drilling Olivia on names, faces, and the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined high society. Remember, Catherine instructed as they reviewed photographs of potential attendees, Mrs. Harrison will ask about your education, but what she's really asking is whether you belong in her social circle. Victoria Lancaster Ashworth will seem friendly, but she's been positioning herself as Richard's primary beneficiary for years. And Edward. Catherine paused at Edward Lancaster's photograph, her expression growing serious. Edward Lancaster is dangerous precisely because he's charming. He'll make you feel like you've found an ally in the family. Right up until the moment he destroys you. But it was during a late-night session in Morrison's law office that Olivia learned the full scope of what she was walking into. There's something else you need to know about your father's death, Morrison said, his voice unusually grave. Something that was never made public. He withdrew a thick folder from his filing cabinet, one that looked like it had been sealed for years. The police investigation into Richard's accident was thorough, too thorough to be explained by routine procedures for a drunk driving. Fatality. Olivia felt a chill run down her spine. What did they find? Evidence that suggested Richard's car had been tampered with. The brake lines showed signs of deliberate damage, but the investigation was quietly closed when the alcohol in his system provided a simpler explanation. You think he was murdered? I think someone wanted him dead, and they were smart enough to make it look like an accident. The question is who had both motive and opportunity. Vivian, who had been silent throughout this revelation, finally spoke. Edward. It had to be Edward. He was the one who stood to gain the most from Richard's death, and he had access to Richard's car through the family compound. But if Edward killed Richard, why would he be threatened by my existence? Olivia asked. Wouldn't he just kill me too? Because murdering a prominent businessman 8 years ago is very different from murdering a young woman in today's media environment, Morrison explained. Edward's older now, more visible, with more to lose. He'd prefer to discredit you or force you to renounce your claims rather than risk the exposure that would come with another suspicious death in the Lancaster family. The weight of this information settled over Olivia like a heavy blanket. She wasn't just claiming an inheritance. She was potentially exposing a murderer who had spent years believing he'd gotten away with the perfect crime. There's more, Morrison continued, and Olivia wondered how many more revelations she could handle in one evening. We've discovered that Edward has been systematically embezzling from the Lancaster Foundation for years. Small amounts carefully hidden, but totaling millions of dollars. Your return threatens not just his inheritance prospects, but his freedom. So he's desperate, Marcus observed from his chair in the corner, where he'd been quietly absorbing the conversation. Which makes him even more dangerous. Exactly. Which is why tomorrow night's revelation needs to be handled perfectly. We get one chance to expose Edward's crimes and protect Olivia simultaneously. Vivian reached across the table and took Olivia's hand, a gesture that was becoming more natural between them, though it still carried the weight of 26 years of separation. I need you to understand something, Vivian said. When I gave you up all those years ago, I thought I was saving you from one monster. I never imagined I might be exposing you to another. If you want to walk away from all of this, I'll understand. I'll find another way to deal with Edward. Olivia looked at her mother, and she was beginning to think of Vivian that way, despite the complicated circumstances of their reunion, and saw genuine fear in those pale blue eyes. Not fear for herself, but fear for the daughter she'd tried so hard to protect. What happens to the foundation if Edward's crimes are exposed? Olivia asked. The foundation? Morrison seemed surprised by the question. The Lancaster Foundation. It provides healthcare funding to low-income families, right? Scholarships for nursing students, medical equipment for community hospitals. What happens to all of that if we destroy the family's reputation? The question revealed something fundamental about who Olivia was, beneath the shocking revelations and wealth she'd inherited. Even faced with personal danger and life-changing decisions, her first concern was for the people who depended on services she'd never personally benefited from, but understood intimately. The foundation would survive, Morrison said softly. In fact, it would probably be stronger under honest leadership. Your leadership, if you chose to take it on. You mean I could actually make a difference? Use this money and influence to help people like the patients I've been caring for. You could transform healthcare access in Chicago, Vivian said, and there was pride in her voice, not pride in Olivia's inheritance, but pride in her character. That's exactly the kind of person I hoped you'd grow up to be. For the first time since learning her true identity, Olivia felt a sense of purpose that went beyond survival or self-discovery. She could take everything that Edward Lancaster had corrupted and use it to actually help people. She could honor the compassion that had made her a good nurse by extending it on a scale she'd never dreamed possible. "Then we do this," she said firmly. "Tomorrow night, we expose Edward's crimes and reclaim the Lancaster name for something better than what it's been." As they left Morrison's office that night, walking toward the parking garage where Marcus's modest car waited next to Vivian's luxury sedan, Olivia felt the silver watch pulse against her wrist with each heartbeat. Tomorrow she would step into a spotlight that could either illuminate the truth or destroy everything she'd worked to build. But for the first time in her life, she wouldn't be stepping into it alone. The annual Lancaster Foundation Gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton, a venue that reeked of old money and older traditions. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables decorated with centerpieces that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries, while Chicago's elite mingled in designer gowns and custom tuxedos that proclaimed their status more effectively than any verbal introduction. Olivia arrived fashionably late, as Vivian had instructed, wearing a midnight blue gown that had been tailored to perfection in just 3 days. The dress transformed her from invisible hospital worker to someone who could command attention in any room, though she still felt like she was wearing a costume for a role she'd never auditioned for. "Remember," Vivian murmured as they entered the ballroom together, "Edward will try to isolate you from witnesses before making his move. Stay visible, stay surrounded by people, and trust your instincts." The crowd parted as they walked through, curious whispers following in their wake. Vivian Lancaster rarely brought guests to these events, and certainly never young women who bore an unmistakable resemblance to her younger self. "Vivian, darling." The voice belonged to Victoria Lancaster Ashworth, a woman in her 60s, whose smile was as sharp as her diamond earrings. "And who is this lovely young lady? You've been keeping secrets from us." "This is Olivia," Vivian replied smoothly, offering no additional explanation that might satisfy Victoria's obvious curiosity. "Charming. And what brings you to our little family gathering, dear?" Before Olivia could respond, a smooth voice interrupted from behind them. "Yes, I'm quite curious about that myself." Edward Lancaster approached with the confident stride of a man who owned every room he entered. He was exactly as imposing as his photograph had suggested, tall, distinguished, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue weaknesses and vulnerabilities with predatory precision. "Uncle Edward," Vivian said coolly, "I don't believe you've met Olivia." Edward extended his hand with practiced charm, but when Olivia took it, she felt the slight pressure of fingers that lingered a moment too long. A test, a claim, a subtle assertion of dominance. "Olivia," he repeated, as if testing the name. "Such a lovely name. And you look so familiar. Have we met before?" "I don't believe so," Olivia replied, her nursing training helping her maintain steady vital signs, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Well, I'm sure it will come to me." Edward's smile never wavered, but there was something predatory in his eyes that made Olivia's skin crawl. "Perhaps we could chat later? I always enjoy meeting Vivian's friends." The way he emphasized friends carried implications that made Olivia want to step backward, but she held her ground. This was exactly the kind of subtle intimidation that Morrison had warned her about. Edward establishing dominance through suggestion and innuendo rather than direct threats. "I'd be delighted," Olivia replied, matching his false charm with her own carefully neutral professionalism. As Edward moved away to greet other guests, Vivian leaned close to whisper, "He knows. I can see it in his eyes. He's figured out who you are." The evening progressed with careful choreography that felt like a dance on the edge of a knife. Olivia was introduced to dozens of people whose names she'd studied, but whose faces carried the casual cruelty of those who'd never had to question their place in the world. They asked polite questions that were really interrogations, searching for any sign that she didn't belong in their rarefied atmosphere. But gradually, something interesting began to happen. The more people Olivia met, the more comfortable she became. These weren't mysterious figures from an unreachable social stratum. They were just people, with the same fears and insecurities as her patients at the hospital. They simply hid their vulnerabilities behind expensive clothes and practiced small talk. When Mrs. Harrison mentioned her recent surgery, Olivia found herself offering genuine medical advice. When young Victoria Lancaster Ashworth's daughter complained about feeling overwhelmed at medical school, Olivia shared strategies for managing stress that she'd learned during her own nursing education. "You're remarkable," murmured James Morrison, who had been observing from across the room. "You're not trying to fit into their world. You're making them fit into yours." It was true. Rather than pretending to be someone she wasn't, Olivia was being exactly who she'd always been, someone who cared about other people's well-being above social conventions or personal advancement. And somehow that authenticity was more compelling than any amount of wealth or status. But the evening's pleasant discoveries were shattered when Edward Lancaster stepped onto the small stage where the evening speakers traditionally addressed the gathered guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried easily over the ballroom's chatter, "I have some rather shocking news to share with you tonight." Vivian's face went pale. This wasn't part of their plan. Edward was supposed to wait for their revelation, not create his own narrative. As many of you know, my family has faced its share of tragedies over the years. The loss of my brother Richard was particularly devastating, not just because of his untimely death, but because of the secrets he left behind. The crowd had gone completely quiet now, sensing drama that was far more interesting than typical charity gala speeches. Tonight, I've discovered that Richard had a daughter who was abandoned as a child, and has now returned to claim a portion of the Lancaster inheritance. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as heads turned, trying to identify this mysterious daughter among the guests. "I'm sure you can imagine how distressing this is for our family," Edward continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "To learn that a stranger, someone with no connection to our values or traditions, believes she has a right to the Lancaster name and fortune." Olivia felt every eye in the room turning toward her as people began to put the pieces together. Edward was playing this perfectly, portraying her as an opportunistic outsider while positioning himself as the protector of family honor. "Of course, we'll need to verify any claims through proper legal channels," Edward said, his gaze finding Olivia across the crowded room. "After all, there are so many people who would do anything for a chance at this kind of wealth. One must be very careful about it." Pretenders. The word hit like a slap. With a single speech, Edward had managed to publicly identify Olivia, while simultaneously undermining her legitimacy. If she remained silent, she'd be seen as weak and possibly fraudulent. But if she responded, she'd be playing into his hands by creating a public spectacle. Vivian stepped forward, her face set with the steely determination that had earned her the nickname Iron Lady. "Edward," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom, "there's something you should know before you continue making accusations you might regret." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Two members of one of Chicago's most powerful families were about to have a confrontation that would be talked about for years, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Edward's confident smile faltered slightly as he realized that Vivian wasn't going to let him control this narrative after all. "The young lady you're so eager to dismiss," Vivian continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is Elena Rose Lancaster, my daughter, Richard's biological child, and she has every legal right to everything. You've been stealing from this family for the past 8 years." The silence that followed Vivian's declaration was deafening. 300 of Chicago's most powerful people stood frozen in a tableau that would be dissected in society pages and gossip columns for months to come. Edward Lancaster's face cycled through expressions of shock, rage, and calculation as he processed the magnitude of what had just happened to his carefully orchestrated plan. "That's quite an accusation." "Vivian," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, "I hope you have proof to support such dramatic claims." "I have 26 years of documentation," Vivian replied, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was revealing. birth records, DNA tests, and most importantly, evidence of your systematic embezzlement from the Lancaster Foundation. The crowd began to murmur, shocked whispers and speculative comments rippling through the ballroom like wildfire. This wasn't just family drama. This was potential criminal activity being exposed at Chicago's most exclusive social event. Edward's mask of charm finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation that had always lurked beneath his polished exterior. "You have no proof of anything," he snarled. "This girl, whoever she is obviously some con artist you've hired to challenge my authority. Did you really think you could manipulate me with such an obvious fraud?" It was the opening Olivia had been waiting for. She stepped forward, moving through the crowd that parted before her like water. Her midnight blue gown caught the light from the chandeliers, but it was her bearing, confident, composed, unafraid, that commanded attention. "You want proof?" she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "Let me tell you about the Lancaster Foundation's recent financial irregularities." Edward's face went ashen as Olivia began, reciting details that only someone with access to internal financial documents would know. Specific account numbers, transfer dates, and amounts that corresponded exactly to his hidden embezzlement scheme. "The interesting thing about stealing from a charity," Olivia continued, her nurse's instinct for calm professionalism serving her well, "is that every transaction leaves a paper trail. Every falsified invoice, every redirected payment, every dollar you've siphoned off from programs meant to help sick children." "How could you possibly know?" Edward began, then stopped himself as he realized he was essentially confessing. "Because I've spent the past week reviewing every foundation record from the past 8 years, Olivia replied, "and because I actually care about the people your theft has hurt. Do you know how many families couldn't afford medical care because you redirected their assistance funds? How many nursing students couldn't finish their education because their scholarship money went into your private accounts?" The crowd was completely captivated now. This wasn't just a family dispute about inheritance. It was a moral reckoning that struck at the heart of what the Lancaster Foundation was supposed to represent. Marcus, who had been positioned near the ballroom's entrance as planned, stepped forward with a leather portfolio that Morrison had prepared for exactly this moment. "Financial records," he announced, handing the portfolio to a society reporter who had been covering the gala. "Bank statements, falsified invoices, and transfer receipts that show 8 years of systematic theft from Chicago's most trusted medical charity." Edward made a desperate play for sympathy, turning to address the crowd directly. "You're going to believe the word of some nobody nurse and a bitter old woman over someone who's dedicated his life to this family's legacy?" It was exactly the wrong thing to say. "That nobody nurse," said Mrs. Harrison, stepping forward with surprising firmness, "just gave me better medical advice in 5 minutes than my personal physician has in months. And that bitter old woman has donated more to Chicago's hospitals than everyone else in this room combined." Other voices began to join in, people who had benefited from Olivia's genuine concern. Throughout the evening, guests who had been charmed by her authenticity rather than intimidated by her status. "She knew about my daughter's medical school struggles," Victoria Lancaster Ashworth added, her voice carrying grudging respect. "Offered real help, not just empty sympathy. Spoke to my wife about her recovery with actual understanding, not just politeness," added a prominent businessman, whom Olivia barely remembered meeting. Edward watched his support crumble in real time as the crowd, that had once deferred to his authority, began to see him clearly for the first time. Without the protection of unquestioned family loyalty, he was revealed as exactly what Olivia had accused him of being, a common thief who had been stealing from the vulnerable while hiding behind charitable respectability. "This is ridiculous," Edward said, his voice rising with desperation. "You can't seriously believe that this imposter has any legitimate claim to the Lancaster name. She's a nobody from nowhere trying to steal what rightfully belongs to—" "To who?" Olivia interrupted, her voice cutting through his bluster with surgical precision. "To you? The man who's been systematically stealing from sick children for 8 years? The man who probably murdered my father to secure his position as executor?" The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. Edward's face went white, then red, then white again as he realized that his carefully constructed life was collapsing in real time before 300 witnesses. "You can't prove that," he whispered. "Actually, we can," Morrison said, stepping onto the stage with police officers who had been waiting outside the ballroom. "Richard's car was examined more thoroughly than you knew, Edward. The brake line tampering was documented, photographed, and filed away pending further investigation. An investigation that's been reopened based on new evidence we provided this afternoon." Edward looked around the ballroom desperately, searching for allies who were no longer there. The same people who had deferred to his authority for years were now staring at him with disgust and betrayal. "Eleanor Rose Lancaster," Vivian said, moving to stand beside her daughter for the first time in 26 years. "Rightful heiress to the Lancaster fortune and the person who's going to restore honor to this family's name." The applause started slowly, a few people clapping tentatively, unsure of the protocol for such an unprecedented situation. But it built steadily as more guests joined in, until the entire ballroom was filled with the sound of approval for a woman who had walked into their world as an outsider and revealed herself to be everything their community claimed to value but rarely embodied. Edward was led away in handcuffs, his protests growing fainter as he was escorted through the same marble corridors where he'd once wielded unquestioned authority. As the crowd gradually returned to their conversations, though with far more excitement than typical gala small talk, Olivia found herself surrounded by people who no longer saw her as an interloper, but as someone who had earned her place through character rather than birthright. "So," Marcus said, grinning as he approached through the crowd, "how does it feel to be officially rich and powerful?" Olivia looked around the ballroom, at the people who were now treating her with genuine respect rather than polite curiosity, at Vivian who was watching her with tears of pride in her eyes, and at the future that stretched ahead of her, complicated but no longer mysterious. "It feels like I finally know who I'm supposed to be," she said, touching the silver watch on her wrist one more time. 6 months later, Olivia stood in the renovated lobby of the Lancaster Community Health Center, watching as families who had never been able to afford quality medical care received treatment from some of Chicago's best physicians. The building had once housed Edward Lancaster's private medical practice, a facility that catered exclusively to the wealthy, while he pillaged funds meant for the poor. Now it served everyone, regardless of their ability to pay. The transformation hadn't been easy. Claiming her inheritance had meant navigating complex legal procedures, managing business interests she'd never imagined owning, and learning to balance her desire for privacy with her responsibilities as one of Chicago's most prominent philanthropists. But every challenge had been worth it for moments like this, watching a young mother hug her daughter after receiving news that her surgery had been successful, seeing elderly patients receive medications they could actually afford, knowing that the money Edward had stolen was finally being used for its intended purpose. "The quarterly reports look excellent," Marcus said, approaching with a stack of financial documents that would have intimidated Olivia just months earlier. He'd transitioned from pediatric nursing to serving as her assistant and closest advisor, a role that suited both his organizational skills and his unshakable loyalty. "The scholarship program has funded 200 nursing students this year, and the free clinic program is expanding to 3 new locations." Olivia smiled, accepting the reports, but setting them aside to focus on the scene unfolding around them. Numbers on paper were important, but the real measure of success was the difference she could see in people's lives, the relief in a parent's face when their child's treatment was covered, the pride in a scholarship recipient's voice when they talked about their future career in healthcare. "Any word from the trial?" Marcus asked. "Edward's lawyers are still negotiating, but Morrison thinks he'll accept the plea agreement. 20 years for embezzlement and conspiracy charges, restitution to the foundation, and forfeiture of all assets gained through his crimes." Olivia's voice held no satisfaction at Edward's downfall, just relief that justice was being served. "The murder charges are harder to prove after all these years, but the financial crimes are ironclad." Vivian approached from across the lobby, moving with the careful grace of someone who had spent decades hiding vulnerability behind perfect posture. Their relationship was still evolving. 26 years of separation couldn't be erased overnight, but they were building something new together, based on mutual respect rather than obligation. The board meeting went well, Vivian reported. Everyone's impressed with the foundation's new direction. Donations are up 40% since the gala, and we have more volunteer applications than we can process. It seemed that Chicago's elite had been inspired by Olivia's example to engage more meaningfully with charitable work. Whether that inspiration came from genuine philanthropic impulses or social pressure to be associated with the city's most talked-about success story, the results were the same: more resources for people who desperately needed them. "There's something I want to show you both," Olivia said, leading them toward a wall that had been under construction for weeks. The workers had finally removed the covering that morning, revealing a memorial plaque that would honor everyone who had contributed to the Lancaster Community Health Center's mission. But it was the central inscription that made Vivian's breath catch. "In memory of those who sacrificed their own happiness to protect the people they loved, and in honor of those who transform inherited power into genuine service." Love finds a way to heal, even across decades of separation. Below the inscription was a small display case containing 2 items: a silver watch with a worn leather band and a matching locket that had been passed down through generations of Lancaster women. "I thought it was time to let other people benefit from the symbols that brought us together," Olivia explained. "The watch and locket will stay here as reminders that family isn't just about blood or money. It's about the choices we make to care for each other." Vivian's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. "Your great-grandmother Elena would be so proud of the woman you've become." She fought against her family's expectations to marry for love rather than status. "I think she would have understood the choice you've made to use your inheritance for service rather than luxury." It was true that Olivia's lifestyle hadn't changed dramatically despite her newfound wealth. She still lived in a modest apartment, still drove a practical car, still found her greatest satisfaction in caring for others rather than accumulating possessions. The difference was that now she could care for others on a scale she'd never dreamed possible. Miss Lancaster, a young woman, approached hesitantly, wearing scrubs that marked her as one of the new nursing students funded by the Foundation's scholarship program. "I just wanted to thank you. Because of the scholarship, I'll be able to finish school and support my family. My little brother has asthma, and now I'll be able to help kids like him get the care they need." Olivia smiled, remembering her own struggles through nursing school and the dream of making a difference that had sustained her through every challenge. "Just promise me you'll pass it forward," she said. "Help someone else the way we've been able to help you." As the young woman nodded eagerly and returned to her studies, Olivia felt the familiar sense of purpose that had always driven her, but amplified by resources she was still learning to wield effectively. "So what's next?" Marcus asked. "Now that you've revolutionized healthcare access in Chicago and brought down a corrupt family dynasty, what do you do for an encore?" Olivia laughed, looking around the lobby filled with people whose lives were being changed by second chances and unexpected opportunities. "I think I'll just keep being a nurse," she said. "I've learned that caring for people is the same whether you're working in a hospital ward or running a foundation. The scale might be different, but the heart of it remains the same." As they left the community center that evening, walking past the bronze plaques that would remind future generations how love and justice had transformed the Lancaster legacy, Olivia realized that she had finally found the answer to the question that had haunted her entire life. She knew exactly where she came from, and more importantly, she knew exactly where she was going. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to remember that their true worth isn't determined by their circumstances, but by the love and care they show to others. Sometimes the family we're born into isn't as important as the family we choose to build through our actions and compassion. Have you ever discovered something about your past that completely changed how you see your future? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.